Greetings, I'm Eric Hinton, and I'm the director of the Dedman School of Law, SMU Rolling Center for Business Law and Leadership in Dallas, Texas. And on behalf of the Rolling Center, as well as Berkeley Executive Education, we welcome you to today's program. I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to mention. First, this program is being recorded. Second, we're offering CLE for California, Missouri, and Texas. For Texas CLE, you can access the QR code that will be placed in the chat box, and Dedman Law will be reporting your CLE to the State Bar of Texas. Berkeley and St. Louis University will be taking care of the California and Missouri CLE respectively. And if you listed a jurisdiction other than the three that I just mentioned, we will provide you with the Texas approval to assist you in applying for the CLE in your respective jurisdictions. Finally, the book that is the subject of today's webinar is available for purchase through the Cambridge University Press website, as well as under other online vendors. So welcome. Since the 1980s, the maximization of shareholder wealth has been the governing norm and the key metric of success in corporate law. In 2018, the Business Roundtable dramatically departed from this norm by changing their definition of corporate purpose to affirm the importance of all stakeholders within the corporation. Earlier this year, in his annual letter to corporate leaders, BlackRock's Larry Fink continued along this path, announcing a center for stakeholder capitalism and suggesting new attention toward employees and the environment. Despite these rhetorical flourishes, however, the core features of corporate law and governance have not changed. In fact, they are not even questioned. Shareholders remain the sole citizens within the corporate body politic. In their new book, Reconstructing the Corporation from Shareholder Primacy to Shared Governance, Professors Matt Bodie and Grant Hayden questioned the underlying assumptions that have supported shareholder primacy and the exclusive shareholder franchise. And we're pleased to have Professors Bodie and Hayden here today to talk about their findings in their book and the broader ramifications for corporate governance and workplace democracy. To join us today with this discussion, we have assembled a fantastic group of panelists with deep expertise in this topic. Joining us are Nicholas Bowie, Assistant Professor at Harvard Law, Vina Dubal, Professor of Law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law, Frank Portnoy, Professor of Law at the Berkeley School of Law, and Leo Strine Jr., former Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court and of counsel at Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz. So welcome, and we thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. For reference, for those attending, more extensive biographies of the authors and panelists were provided as advanced materials. Today's program will proceed as follows. Professors Bowie and Hayden will first provide a summary of their book. Following this, I will invite each of our panelists to make introductory remarks about the book in the context of their specific area of research. After the introductory remarks, the authors and panel will engage in a discussion about the book and the points that it raises. We will also invite questions from the audience to the Q&A function, and the authors and panel will address them as time permits. Professors Bodie and Hayden.
All right. Well, thank you. I want to start by thanking Eric Hinton and Ruan Manges at the Rowling Center here at SMU. I also want to thank Adam Sterling at the Berkeley Center who helped put this together, along with, of course, our panelists for taking the time to participate in this event. I was going to talk through the first part of our book and then turn it over to Matt to talk through the second part, just to give people a feel for it. By way of background, as most of you know, shareholder primacy is the dominant theory of the corporation in the United States. This idea that corporations should be structured and run in a way to maximize shareholder wealth. And the way this theory gets put into action is through the mechanisms of corporate governance. And the most significant feature of our corporate governance system is that shareholders, and shareholders alone for the most part, have the right to vote on the board of directors and make other significant corporate decisions. while this exclusive shareholder franchise has been around a long time, it really wasn't until about 40 years ago that its theoretical justifications were fleshed out by corporate governance scholars, most of whom were operating in the tradition of law and economics. And in time, those scholars and others began to settle on 3 or 4 arguments as to why corporate voting should be limited to shareholders. And you now see these arguments throughout the literature. Matt and I think these arguments are lacking. And so one of the reasons we wrote this book was to pin down and scrutinize these arguments all in one place to help in part to help prevent the kind of opportunistic shifting that you get from one argument to the other as the situation demands. The book itself really focuses on 3 of the principal arguments, all of which coincidentally or not so coincidentally show up in Frank Easterbrook and Daniel Fischel's 1996 book, The Economic Structure of Corporate Law, and they actually showed up in an earlier 1980s paper on corporate voting. Today, I thought I'd mention the 3 arguments briefly and then spend a little bit more time on one of them just to give people who haven't read the book a sense of the book. The first argument in favor of shareholder voting or exclusive shareholder voting, we call the argument from the residual. And that argument is that shareholders alone should vote because shareholders are the sole residual claimants. They're paid only after all the other contractual participants in the corporation are paid. They essentially get the leftovers, in other words, the profits, and this gives them the appropriate incentives to make firm decisions for the benefit of the entire corporation. The second main argument is what we call the argument from Arrow's theorem, Arrow's impossibility theorem. The argument here is when voters hold dissimilar preferences, it's impossible to aggregate them into a consistent set of choices. And because we're talking about social choice theory and Arrow's theorem, by consistent, we mean acyclic, that is, they don't cycle. If firms make inconsistent choices, they will, according to Easterbrook and Fischel, self-destruct. And so shareholders with their homogeneous preferences and wealth maximization are in the best position to avoid these firm destroying voting cycles. Both of these arguments we think have significant problems. The second one is almost incoherent, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the details of those. I wanted to spend a little more time on a third argument that's made, and this is the Contractarian argument for shareholder voting. And the background belief here is that a corporation is best thought of as a nexus of contracts made by corporate constituents. And what that means in this context is that any particular feature of corporate governance is somehow freely chosen by all of the participants and therefore presumptively efficient. And this includes, of course, the main governance feature of corporations, which is the exclusive shareholder franchise. In other words, this argument is that all corporate constituents have essentially agreed to give shareholders exclusive voting rights. Now, there are a lot of problems with the initial version of this argument, the strong version of this Contractarian argument. One problem is that it's not literally true, that corporations cannot be reduced to just a set of interlocking contracts. You can't, for example, contract for limited liability. So there are features of corporations that cannot be reduced to contract. But it's also not true that all corporate constituents agreed in any meaningful sense to give the shareholders all the power. There are many real-world reasons why firm constituents aren't in a position to choose another system of governance. And we actually have evidence from other countries, including Germany, that in situations where some constituents like labor and capital have roughly equal bargaining power, they actually both want seats in the boardroom, unsurprisingly, and bargain for that governance system. Once it became clear to the authors of this Contractarian argument that corporations aren't actually a nexus of contracts, the fallback position here became that the nexus of contracts model wasn't an actual description of corporations, but more a good metaphor for what was going on in corporate governance. And the argument continues, while actual shareholders and other constituents didn't contract for exclusive shareholder control, hypothetical shareholders and other hypothetical constituents as well would have contracted for this system. That is, it's the ideal contract that would have maximized the size of the pie for everybody. In other words, the argument became that the corporate form, including exclusive shareholder voting, is the product of an imagined ex-ante bargain among all the members of the many corporate constituencies. The problem here, though, is, of course, that at this point, the contractarian argument gives up any pretense of being an independent argument for the shareholder franchise. Why? Because it depends on convincing you that all these hypothetical constituents would have agreed to this system of governance. But that means you're going to have to come up with independent arguments as to why they should. So at best, this argument just piggybacks on the back of other arguments for shareholder voting. And in the end, these hypothetical shareholders and hypothetical constituents are really just a rhetorical trick that allows contractarians to try to link existing governance features in the corporation to free choice and all the normative goodness that supposedly comes out of free choice. And by the way, this contractarian argument not only shows up in the literature all over the place, but it also shows up in the form of a question that I've seen asked in virtually any panel or conference where somebody gives a paper questioning the exclusive shareholder control of corporations. And the question is essentially, if expanding the corporate electorate beyond shareholders is so good, why doesn't everyone do it? The fact that they don't do it proves that it actually isn't good. So the current system must be the best one. There are a whole host of reasons, of course, why firms and why constituents may not be in a position to unilaterally adopt a different system of governance. But so you see this contractarian argument show up both in the literature and in the way people think about the corporate electorate. So Matt and I think these basic arguments in the law and economics literature in favor of exclusive shareholder voting, which is the core feature of shareholder primacy, are for the most part wrong-headed. And a couple of things I find interesting about this, and then I'll turn it over to Matt. One thing I find interesting about this is that these arguments fail on their own terms. That is, these arguments, at least our position is, they fail as applications of standard economics and social choice theory. When you see someone purporting to apply standard economics, a field that positively fetishizes preference fulfillment, when you see that person tack away from actual preferences and begin to build their theory on the back of hypothetical preferences or hypothetical constituent preferences, that's a tell that something went wrong. In economics, you take preferences as they come. You don't get to manufacture preferences as you wish them to be. Similarly, the argument from Arrow's theorem fails not because Arrow's theorem and social choice theory is wrong, but because the argument is based on a gross misapplication of the theorem. So in a way, our book seeks to be an inside job. That is, we take the basic precepts of economics and social choice theory seriously when we confront these arguments. So that's one thing that I think is worth mentioning. The other thing I think worth mentioning is in the last few decades, there's really been no attempt to salvage these basic arguments or to come up with new ones, which I find interesting and maybe telling. So the conclusion in the first 2/3 of our book is that these foundational arguments for the core feature of shareholder primacy are flawed. The second part's a little more forward-looking and maybe more optimistic. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt for that.
All right. Thanks a lot, Grant. And I just wanted to quickly add my thanks to Eric and Ruan and the folks at the Rowling Center for Business Leadership and Law for hosting this. Thanks to Adam Sterling, Lily Yang, and the folks at Berkeley Law Executive Education for co-sponsoring the event. And of course, thanks to our fabulous panelists. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them, and I'm sure you are too. So I'm going to jump right in where Grant left off and say essentially, so at this point in the book, we have arrived at the idea that shareholder primacy should not be the clear and unquestioned methodology that undergirds the entirety of corporate law. We do not think, as Rainer Crackman and Henry Hansman so memorably put it in their article in 2001, that we are at the end of history of corporate law. But if we are to move beyond shareholder primacy, what's next? What should we do next? So one theory is that we should essentially look to shareholders and other participants in the corporation beyond shareholders. So stakeholder theory, stakeholder primacy, I've heard it called, stakeholderism. The problem with stakeholderism from our perspective is that it does not provide governance rights to those stakeholders, along with the idea that stakeholders should be taken into account. So the basic argument that we've generally seen from stakeholder folks is that boards need to take into account all stakeholders when making decisions about the corporation. And we saw this a little bit with corporate constituency statutes in the late 80s and early 90s. The problem is that voters are still shareholders and the board is still elected by shareholders. And so ultimately what you have under stakeholderism is you have a board with less accountability to shareholders and not really any accountability to others as well. Now, this kind of set of directors has kind of been called Platonic guardians or mediating hierarchs. And the idea is that if we, have have folks who are less responsive to the electorate, we might end up with better decision making. And folks like Stephen Bainbridge have argued that we could have Platonic guardians who will better serve shareholders. And on the other side, we have folks like Margaret Blair and Lynn Stout who have argued that we should have stakeholder theory with real investment in the stakeholders, not shareholder primacy, but actually looking out for all of the different stakeholders who are involved in the corporation. But as our co-panelist, Leo Strine, has very ably explained in a series of articles, it is a fool's errand to think that if you keep the shareholder electorate and then you just give more flexibility to directors, that they will then suddenly have a moment of inspiration and decide to act in the benefit of everyone in the corporation when their job depends on being elected and reelected by shareholders and shareholders alone. So, so we think there are some weaknesses with the primary alternative theory. And so what do we propose? Well, we propose that we need to change the actual corporate electorate. So in our view, there are two constituencies that deserve to have the right to vote: shareholders, as currently have that right, but also employees. And our book supports the argument that both of these groups deserve voting power. And we kind of looked at two different theories. One is based on the economic theory of the firm, and the other is based on democratic participation theory. So in terms of the theory of the firm tries to explain why we have firms in the first place, why we have these separate and legally created organizations, right? Why not just have contracts, right? The firm versus the market, organizations versus individual contractual relations. It's ironic, of course, that there are so many corporate law academics that compare corporations to an excess of contracts, when in fact, the entire point of the theory of the firm is to say that firms are different and firms are not just contracts. And in fact, they need something more. They need something more in the law. And that's why we have business entity law, right? The purpose of corporate law, and we would argue all of business entity law essentially, but specifically corporate law in our book here, the purpose is to bring people together to facilitate joint production, to enable a group of people to come together, combining different kinds of resources and cooperate to produce goods, services, or intellectual property. The two primary sets of participants in the firm are workers and investors, capital and labor, right? Those are the two sets of people that come together in the firm and endeavor to carry on this joint enterprise. And the idea of the corporation and corporate law is to basically take these two groups and put them together so that they can produce things and have a system of governance, that arranges that. So it creates like one legal package, or one legal person, right? Because a corporation is a person under the law. We've left employees out for too long, right? Ronald Coase believes, in talking about his theory of the firm, that the existence of the economic firm was demonstrated by the legal relationship between employer and employee. And given the critical roles of workers within the corporation, it seems wrong to us to exclude workers from corporate governance. You are essentially taking a group of people who are governed by the structure, and you are excluding them from governance. All right, so that leads to our second argument about democratic participation. Who should have voting rights within any particular governance structure is a very tricky question in a lot of situations, because a lot of people have interests, a lot of people have preferences that might be meaningfully affected by the governance structure, but how do we decide who gets to vote and who doesn't, right? This is something that democratic theorists have spent a lot of time working through. We think that employees and shareholders are clear winners in the case for voting rights. They have a strong interest in the ongoing life of the company. They participate in its ongoing business activities. They're easy to designate for voting rights purposes, and they make it easy to aggregate their individual preferences. They are also vulnerable to, when you could frame it as vulnerable or greatly affected by decisions that the corporation makes in carrying out the business of the firm. So we're open to the potential for other stakeholders, such as consumers, creditors, suppliers, even the larger community, to participate in firm governance. And our theory is flexible enough to accommodate voting rights for other constituents when there is an adequate marker for their interest that can be easily managed, when we have the practical ways of managing their participation. But those markers and that management is clearly available for those who own shares and those who are employees. So changing the corporate electorate to include shareholders and employees may seem like a huge leap for US law, but similar systems of shared governance are very common in other parts of the world. A number of European countries have systems of co-determination. Germany's is the most well-known and the most robust. And there's a lot of research that shows that German co-determination has been very stable, resilient, and prosperous in its approach to corporate governance. I am painting with a broad brush here, but research has shown that shareholders do well, creditors are better protected, and workers are, in fact, more willing to make short-term sacrifices when crises hits in order to help plan for a better future. And this is something that, if you look at how German companies responded to, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, you'll see that they did not have the same dramatic fluctuations that a lot of US corporations did. But this research is really taking off in the last 10 years. And I'm really hopeful that our fellow corporate law academicians here will take notice of the support, the empirical support for co-determination across the globe. So right now there is support for worker participation here in the United States, right? Senators Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin and Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts have both proposed bills proposing that workers actually elect either 30% or 40% of the corporate board in elections. Actually, very recently, Senator Marco Rubio proposed a bill that included a worker elected director. Now it's a non-voting director, and so we, not what we're looking for, but hey, we appreciate that there's at least a move in that direction. And in fact, Orrin Cass, who's a former domestic policy advisor for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, he is running the American Compass, and that organization just put out an argument for co-determination as well. So we're hopeful that this is something that will appeal to a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. But we are not, I want to say sound foolish, right? We know that there's a long way to go to establishing why this is good, particularly for workers, obviously, but that we think it would help our economy and our political system as a whole, right? There's a lot of reasons to be thinking about this, and we just would love for the political dialogue to encompass this incredibly important issue of worker democracy, to confront that and take that on and build that into the policy discussions that are happening here and across the country. So we're really excited to have this terrific panel here today. I'm so grateful that all of you have joined us and taken your time to either listen in or participate in the conversation. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Eric. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. That was very interesting, and it provides a great foundation for the rest of our discussion. So we're going to now hear opening remarks from each of our panelists in the form of a question that I will pose. I noticed we've gotten some good questions already through the Q&A feature, so I would encourage our participants, if you like, to put those in, and we will get to those to the extent we're able to as we get to the roundtable discussion. So let's go ahead and start with Chief Justice Strine. And we heard already reference a number of your writings. You've written specifically on public benefit corporations and mandatory employee environmental, social, and governance factors to rectify some of the excesses of shareholder primacy. What are some of the practical roadblocks to moving in this direction, and how can they be overcome?
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor to be with this group and to comment in a discussion on this provocative and timely book, of which the themes of which I largely agree with. I think the obstacles to moving in a more stakeholder direction are in some ways related directly to the imbalance in corporate governance that's resulted over the last 50 years. People often fetishize just Milton Friedman's point about corporations sort of just focusing on profit. What people forget about Uncle Milton is he was against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He was against the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. He was against the National Labor Relations Board. And so when he said to leave the protections for other stakeholders to external law, Eric, he actually didn't believe in external law. And Justice Powell, before he was Justice Powell, joined with the Friedmanite Revolution, which became the Reagan Revolution, to say that corporate America should go to war on those stakeholder protections. And they did. And as a result, there's been the use of corporate funds to lobby, to elect officials, to essentially undermine the external regulatory protections that protect workers, consumers, the communities in which corporations operate. And so we've had an interactive effect here with a seismic increase in stockholder power. And I think, one of the things that our able authors didn't sort of focus on is how different the world is in terms of who the stockholders are, their institutions. And that's another thing that undermines the traditional model, because they're agents themselves, and they're playing a game where their incentives are very different than their underlying investors. Their underlying investors, the human ones who are much more aligned with the workers in the companies, and they have diversified portfolios, and they want growth net of externalities. The obstacles to getting where we are, and they are in some ways political. There's a divisiveness in the nation, but there's also can be a question about extending too quickly to some things. For example, I've written a paper. I very much believe in increasing worker voice. I think the bills in Congress, and I'm hoping there's going to be a better bill, the bills in Congress are statement bills. And Eric, we don't have works councils in the US. We don't have the prevalency of unions. Workers on boards without a supporting infrastructure is not, in my view, that useful a step. And I think we also have to grapple with the geographic extent of the US and where do you get candidates. And so I think there needs to be, I think the obstacles are we need to get back to where we once belonged, JoJo. If you haven't seen the Beatles sessions on Let It Be. It's good to watch, but part of some of the things I've suggested and others is to restore a little bit of balance. And that's why something like the PBC model, which is in 33 states, something people can identify with it. It's not such that these people are all going to be able to do great and good things. It's that they have a legal duty to respect all stakeholders, Eric, and that gives them some room to do so. And there's some enforcement behind it, which is a counterbalance to the market. And so it's a useful recalibration. Does it get you everywhere that you want to be ultimately? No, but in this environment, it's quite important. The idea of maybe requiring companies to have a workforce committee, requiring disclosure, and so that people know more about how companies operate creates more of a level playing field for people trying to make money the right way. Overcoming the public-private divide. Public companies have had too much heaped on them without corresponding responsibilities for private companies that have the same impact on stakeholders in society and even on investors, because most of them operate and take capital through pension funds, charities, and others that affect ordinary people under SEC exemptions. So I think one of the practical obstacles that we got to overcome is reminding us what the system is all about, that we did not form corporations solely to benefit stockholders, that the old conception of stockholders was that they were stuck in and that they would harvest at the end and only if everyone else had a meal. And I think the two authors do a good point of showing that model is just broken and that we need to build on some sensible models around the world, but put them in the US context. And I think we do have to deal with the role of corporate political spending, and that's going to have to be through corporate law because of what the Supreme Court did. So those are a few rambling, very quick thoughts on, and don't do justice to the fine work of these authors.
Thank you, Chief Justice Strine. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those points in more detail in our roundtable discussion. Professor Duval, let's talk with you next. You've written extensively on the rights of platform workers and precarious nature of work in the gig economy. What kinds of governance mechanisms do you think are important to empower workers within that workplace? And do we use different structures for different types of workers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to start by saying that what Grant and Matt do here, what they make a detailed theoretical case for here, is ultimately some form of co-determination, as you've heard, between shareholders and employees through voting. And that this is precisely what, in my own research, I have found that workers across the labor movement have been trying to accomplish for some time. And what the authors, what Matt and Grant do so powerfully is carefully dissect the illogics of the ideas that got us to where we are here today. The book, as you've heard, thinks through the politics and possibilities of shared power while incisively undermining the contractarian ideologies that undergird traditional law and economics and the doctrine of shareholder primacy. And in thinking about the contributions of this book, I wanted to sort of use my own research and expertise to contextualize their case by thinking through some of the ways in which labor advocates have, over the past few decades, thought about this problem and the relationship between capitalism, inequality, and democracy. So I should add again that my own reflections are rooted in my own subjectivity as a labor-oriented academic that has been researching, as you articulated, the intersections between and among democracy, technology firms, and inequality. So the first thing I want to think through is, in the backdrop of all of this in the US, there were roughly 2 to 3 decades, the mid-20th century, where we had some form of shared power between workers and corporations and some degree of worker control over business decisions. And this was in the context of high rates of unionization and over a culture of union contracts that directly addressed not just wages and working conditions, but actually the kinds of business decisions that are now traditionally left to corporate boards. So since then, with the simultaneous evisceration of unions and the rise of shareholder primacy, one path that labor advocates have taken is to sort of co-opt the logic of stakeholder governance by themselves becoming shareholders. So for example, UFCW owns a great deal of Uber shares, and they've used this sort of ownership to introduce shareholder proposals that are intended to benefit Uber workers. And this kind of shareholder activism, as Professor Jacoby at the Anderson School has written about in his book, The Age of Finance, it has not been particularly effective, but it has had some very important it's done some important cultural work. Another form of shared power between workers and corporations that has surfaced through the voluntary adaptation of employer stock option plans, or ESOPs. This is primarily mid-size and small firms over a number of sectors, like Chobani, for example, in 2016, when they gave away 10% of the company's shares to employees. And these ESOPs, there's some evidence that they increase worker compensation, productivity, profitability. But because workers maintain minority ownership, they're not in any way sort of a united voting bloc, critics of these ESOPs have argued that, in fact, they usurp and absorb the potential for real co-determination. And then, of course, in an entirely other form of power sharing at the firm level, we have also seen the ascent of cooperatives, particularly in some of the platform sectors that I study. And in this context, you see workers who have left dominant firms and developed these cooperatively owned structures in hopes to sort of exert direct shared control over their profits and work lives. And while this is an idealistic option, cooperatives are increasingly impossible given the political economy of most concentrated markets, which are occupied by monopolists and duopolists. So the final way in which labor advocates and their allies have thought about subverting the devastations brought on by shareholder primacy is precisely through the means outlined in this book. And that is through literally pushing to get seats at the table. For example, in my research among Google workers, the Google walkout organizers, I found that these tech workers wanted primarily not to get rid of arbitration clauses, but much more broadly to gain control over their everyday work lives and the ways in which their labor is being used to produce, in their making, unethical software for warfare and surveillance. The Googlers in my research and their multiple years of organizing and engaging in different direct actions demanded exactly what Bodie and Hayden have laid out in the case for in this book, seats on the Google board. So all of these different different types of shared power models that I've laid out here are forms of financial inclusion that disrupt the dominant paradigm of workplace governance, but they do so to varying degrees. And I would say what distinguishes these forms is the degree to which they endorse or are rooted in an anti-subordination ethos. So while the emphasis in reconstructing the corporation is about the demise of the ideology of shareholder primacy as a way to address issues like economic inequality and global warming, I also want to underscore the ways in which co-determination as a form of corporate governance is central to the ways in which workers think about democracy more broadly. So in my own research, I found that workers understood organizing for co-determination at Google as being fundamentally rooted in a politics of decolonization, of anti-war, and of anti-racism. And in interviews, they conveyed to me that they felt they had more of a say in the democratic process at work than they did at their local ballot box. And this is because of the degree to which a very few companies, located primarily in the US and China, the companies that they work for have a tremendous unchecked power over our everyday lives, including our financial prospects and how we understand our world, which is, of course, Shoshana Zuboff has so powerfully explained. And this unchecked corporate power is precisely what makes this book, Reconstructing the Corporation, one of the most important and clarion proposals to address the range of social and political ills that have emerged through and with the illogic of shareholder primacy. And I look forward to teaching it. I look forward to engaging it more. I think it's going to be really central to proposals, to shaping existing proposals in Congress, and also to ones that hopefully will come out of the progressive politics emerging on a grassroots level over the coming years.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Duval. Professor Portnoy, question for you. Your recent article on shareholder primacy said that it may suffer from greater defects than just lack of support, and it may be incompatible with basic principles of logic. Can you explain what this means and where it takes us?
Thanks so much, and thanks for including me. I'm thrilled to be here. Congratulations on the book. It's great. You know that I voted myself on the book by providing a blurb that talks about it being an authoritative and comprehensive rebuttal to the notion that corporations should be run for the benefit of shareholders primarily. And I was interested in hearing Grant talk about the book as being, and the goal as being to put everything in one place. I described it in the blurb as being one-stop shopping for readers who want to understand the arguments about shareholder primacy and their flaws. So congratulations, and I'm so happy to be here celebrating the book. And I thought you did a just splendid job of outlining the basic arguments in the book. And one of the things that I wanted to try to add to the discussion is taking a step back from each of these arguments in the book, asking whether the notion of shareholder primacy makes logical sense. And I think it flows through the three sub-arguments that Grant articulated. And I do have this chapter. I like math. I'm a math major. And so it has an equation. Don't worry, there's not a lot of math that I'm going to talk about today, but it has an equation that has a number of variables raised to the fourth power. So I was particularly excited to have that opportunity. And the reason was just to show that one of the arguments in terms of logic that is often not used in thinking about shareholder primacy is proof by counterexample. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes going through a few proofs by counterexample to show that some of these basic principles that Grant and Matt talk about in the book don't even hold up to basic ideas of logic. So if you want to think about the next 4 minutes that I'm going to talk about, it's essentially what would Spock say, right? About whether this is logical or not, putting aside the policy questions that we might all want to ask about employees versus shareholders. So basically the idea in a proof by counterexample or counterfactual is to set up a scenario and show that it doesn't make sense based on the assumptions using an example. And so I'll just, since I was noticing Grant and Matt talking about the book in slightly different ways, I'll just use them for this, and we'll do one based on capital structure. So I'll just ask you to imagine that we've set up a company and we have the same opportunities available regardless of the capital structure that we would use. So one version of the company might have Grant as the equity holder and Matt as the debt holder. And a second version of the company might have Matt getting warrants or options. Grant as the options and warrants, and Matt as the equity. And so the idea here is Grant and I both went to University of Kansas. We share a love of the Jayhawks. We're necessarily more risk-seeking in our behavior. So we have two companies that have raised the same amount of money. They have the same projects available to them. But now we import shareholder primacy. And notice what it does. It leads us to very different results for the two companies. It leads us to conclude that we should maximize and defer to and give votes to Grant in the first instance, because Grant's position from a capital structure perspective is labeled as equity. But in the second case, we should defer to Matt, because Matt's position is labeled equity, even though where the positions fit nominally is very different from where they fit economically. And I think the sole residual claimant, the aggregation theorem argument, and the contractarian argument that Grant discussed so eloquently all suffer from this kind of logical problem in the proof by counterexample. I also think that in terms of thinking about the residual claimant, that there's a logical flaw. And there's a thread of this that came through some of Matt's comments talking about how workers and investors are really the two sets of human participants in the firm. And so we can imagine situations where one group versus the other would be the residual claimant. And so the idea that again, proof by counterexample, the idea from a shareholder primacy perspective that what you always want to do is maximize shareholder value because the shareholder is the residual claimant, we just know is not true. And the controversial example I like to give that I think, I looked at the participant list. I know many of you, so hi, good to see you. But that I give to some professors and to my students is an example where the residual claimant actually is the employees, not the shareholders. And of course, that example is the modern investment bank. So I used to work at Morgan Stanley, and I can tell you that the residual claimants are the employees. And at the end of the year, there's a decision made about what should be given to shareholders. And so this notion that with various institutions, I think Vina just described some constraints that employees can have in various contexts where they wouldn't be thought of as a residual claimant. But in some situations, I think they can be thought of, and they actually are the residual claimant. I'll just leave you with one last one as a logical matter, which is the idea of a future claimant, the idea that time adds some complexities from a logical perspective to how we think about shareholder primacy. And so just imagine that you have an equity holder now who owns all the stock of a hypothetical firm, but they've agreed to sell that stock in a year for 10% more than the value of the stock. We can think of the transfer over time between a present holder of stock and the future holder of stock as transferring all of the risks that Easterbrook and Fischel and law and economics scholars think about when they think about why we would give rights, why we would talk about shareholder primacy with respect to a current shareholder. But of course, the residual claim in this kind of an instance is not the current shareholder, it would be the future claimant. If it's a swap contract, for example, an equity swap or total return swap, it would actually be the swap counterparty that's the economic residual claimant. And I don't think anyone says that we should be maximizing firm value based on the economics of the swap counterparty. So, and this is not a just fanciful counterfactual, it's not just a mathematical exercise. This is actually what we can think of conceptually as happening in the financial crisis, when really the residual claimants, the people we should be concerned about at the banks, were not the shareholders, but were the future taxpayers that had to bail out the shareholders. So the basic idea here that I've been talking about this, kind of beating the drum on logic, adding logic to the debate about shareholder primacy, is one that I think is very consistent with the notions that are in this excellent book. And so if the basic idea of shareholder primacy doesn't even fulfill simple logical principles, maybe it's time to look for something different and look to reconstructing the corporation as a major new piece of scholarship that is the one-stop shopping for us as we try to find alternatives. Thanks again for including me.
Thank you, Professor Portnoy. I think that Spock might be persuaded, so that's excellent. Next, we'll go to Professor Bowie. Your recent article, Anti-Democracy, talks about the importance of democratic structures outside of state governments. What sort of structures are necessary to create democracy in the workplace?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel, and thanks for just giving me another opportunity to read this fantastic book. There's something really radical about Bodie and Hayden's call for democratizing corporations. And in thinking about what structures would make corporations more democratic, I just want to provide a slightly longer time horizon than we've been discussing so far to another era in which people called for democratizing corporations. And the era I have in mind is 200 years ago, when people were talking about cities. And so if you consider what did corporations look like 200 years ago, a lot of them looked like they do today, except there was no real difference in structure between the typical banking corporation and the typical manufacturing corporation and the typical municipal corporation, the typical city. So city of Boston or Philadelphia or New York, like a Bank of Boston or a Bank of Philadelphia or a Bank of New York, all had elected boards. They all had charters. They all had the structure, the formal, literal structure of these are corporations. And importantly, they all limited the franchise to property owners. The norms that we expected, or the norms that people expected of municipal corporations, were roughly analogous to the norms that people expected of financial corporations or any other corporations. And so in response to arguments about, I don't think that people should only be able to participate in city governance if they own property in that city, the response was what you might expect from responses today of why should corporations expand the franchise? So for example, why should poor people get to vote if they don't have a stake in the game? If poor people could vote, all they would do is use the city or the state's taxing power to make decisions that would serve their own interests and harm the wealthy. When you own property in a city, you care more about making sure that the city's government makes good decisions. Expanding the franchise to people beyond those who own the most property in the corporation could risk leading the corporation to make decisions that harm the financial or the overall well-being of the corporate governance. And so in the 1820s, if you were to ask, what structures would be necessary to make a corporation democratic, Americans fought over that. And the answer with respect to municipal corporations was what we have seen over the past 200 years. First of all, expand the constituency of the corporation, eliminate a property ownership requirement so that if you live in a city, you can participate, you can vote, you can run for office. Universal suffrage, instead of allowing only white men to participate if they own property, expand the suffrage to include everyone who is affected by city decisions. Instead of allowing people to vote on the basis of how much they own, instead have one person, one vote. So even if I have lived here forever and I own property in the city and my kids go to the schools here, I still have the same one vote as someone who has just moved here 2 weeks ago. And so today, municipal corporations like Boston or Philadelphia, they're all far more democratic than they were in the 18th century. But business corporations haven't followed the same trajectory. If anything, banks and manufacturing corporations and all the rest have become, if anything, less democratic. And our sort of understanding of what corporate democracy looks like would never pass if we were to apply that to a typical democracy outside the corporate context, in which the people who are affected by corporate decisions don't participate on a routine basis. The norm of one share, one vote would never fly. If the United States said, oh, we're going to have a $1, one vote rule from now on, people would riot in the streets. And so there's nothing natural about the democratization of municipal corporations. Like, it's not as though they had to become more democratic. And there's also nothing natural about the absence of democracy within business corporations. Labor unions for over a century have argued for industrial democracy, for constitutional conventions of the working class, for the ability to participate through shared governance or co-determination models. In other countries, unions have been more successful, as the book illustrates, especially with Nordic countries or Germany. But it's a product of choices over time, not private firms must be exceptions from overall norms of democracy. It's also not as though corporations today, business corporations included, are these like private enterprises that have nothing to do with government either. Corporations remain a very important form of organization, not because nature invented corporations along with trees, but because states charter corporations. Corporations have always been chartered for some purpose, even though corporate charters today are formulaic, like you just have to apply on a website. I think we as a democratic society still have an interest in ensuring that the institutions in which most of us spend most of our working days and which occupy tremendous sources of power in both the politics as well as the broader economy, we have a strong interest in ensuring that these aren't these like undemocratic lumps of butter coagulating in a pail of buttermilk. So answering a question of what structures are necessary for making business corporations democratic, I think is the same answer I would give for what makes a municipal corporation democratic. So starting with expand the franchise, make sure that people who participate in making corporations what they are can participate in them and can vote in them. Define constituencies broadly. And in the political context, so in the city of New York, for example, I think it's very clear that just because people have the formal power to vote does not mean that decisions are necessarily made democratically. So we've had a formal franchise for men, at least in this country, since the 1870s. But that does not mean that the United States in all its dimensions has been democratic. And I think cities, municipal corporations, are experimenting with all kinds of democratic decision-making, using forms of proportional representation, immigrant voting, democracy vouchers of ensuring that even people who have no money to spend on campaigns or to donate to elected officials still can participate in the same way as their wealthy neighbors. Juries, the idea that we can have representative democracy without necessarily electing people, but by simply picking people at random almost to represent us by virtue of their identity. All of the forms of experiments and democratic structure in a typical city can be applied in some ways to business corporations as well. They both have the same origin. They're both formally the same structure. It's just a question of how we want the decisions that these institutions make to fit within a broader democratic structure. And so I think it's also really important to recognize that democracy may have to be balanced against other considerations. A democratic society does not need to make all of its decisions by ballot. Democracy does not mean everyone gets in a room and votes on things, or everyone gets in a room and deliberates. Democracy is compatible with flexible decision-making. And just as, in outside of the corporate context, there are contexts in which we want experts to make decisions. We want, to put the decisions in the hands of one person. All of that may be true in a business corporation as well. We may think that small corporations should be treated differently from large corporations, or new corporations from old corporations, or bankrupt corporations from solvent corporations. But I think what's really important, what I love the most about this book, is that when we do depart from democracy, we should be clear about why we are doing so, why we are sacrificing democracy in one dimension, and what other values we think we are serving by sacrificing democracy. Because in the typical city, to say I'm sacrificing democracy here because I believe in efficiency would get you voted out of office. And as we decide how we want the decisions to be made that affect us the most, decisions made by our employers and our the sources of our broader economy, I think democracy is an important value, as it is everywhere else.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We'll now reconvene our panel, and we'll move into some prepared questions. We also have a number of excellent questions from our audience, some of which are being answered real time. So I'll direct our participants to some of those questions and answers. I think I'd like to start out, though, first of all, with the idea of where in this model the ideal role of shareholders should be within corporate governance, if not the current structure. Who'd like to start?
I mean, I'm happy to take a crack. This has been an obsession with mine of, for the entire century is, I think there's been you can fool audiences very easily, even of professors, by going, what companies are most Americans stockholders of? And they'll say things like Alphabet and General Motors and Amazon. And it's really Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock. And we've really, another thing that contributes to the insight here and what everybody has said is that most American workers have become forced capitalists, is what I call them, Eric. I mean, in the sense that you're not really guaranteed a pension fund. You have to really put money aside. You're not able to actually invest in individual companies. You give it to intermediaries, and they do the stewardship on your behalf. that's designed to help you, right? But what are your real economic interests? The reality is that only the top 1% of the United States owes more of their wealth to, actual assets outside of work. Even most of the top 5%, most of their wealth is derived from work, and their invested capital is incidental to their success as workers. And so what I mean about the role of stockholders is part of why I think ESG disclosure and stuff has to extend, Grant and Matt, to investors themselves, not just put the pressure on the companies, is that there's the role of stockholders. You have to look at these institutions and they have to start thinking about who they are represented, which are folks who are broadly invested in the economy. They often own companies in all industries, and they own several companies within the same industry. And they have a shared interest in growth net of externalities, and growth that is fair to workers, because each of them, most of these folks derive, again, more of what they're going to save for the retirement, Eric, is determined by what they get paid. And so I think the role for investors is we have to have fiduciary duties and responsibility for them, just like we do for companies, to care about the right thing and to be faithful. Is that an adequate answer? No. But frankly, I do think you quoted Larry Fink and others, and I think State Street and others are doing a better job. And I think that is helpful to bringing about alignment. It's not adequate, but it is a crucial thing, because we're not going to get to this case. And even in Germany and Scandinavia, and I applaud them, equity still has the high hand, I think we would acknowledge. And so there's no way you don't have to please your investors in the long run. Frankly, your workers want to please them. But it is really important how institutions behave. And frankly, labor affiliated funds and others made mistakes over the last 20 years and put pressure on companies to manage to the market and hurt their workers. And the loss in jobs and in fair pay wage increases hurt workers way more than any gain in their portfolio. Because, and I'll finish with this and I'll let others get in, is the stockholder class, even though it's democratizing, to pick up on Professor Bowie, even though it's democratizing, the bulk of the stock is still owned by the haves. And so if you really want better distributional effects, $1 more into per hour of wages at a company compared to $1 more in dividend is likely to have much better, wider and positive social consequences. Actually, also much more likely, I would argue, Frank, you're deeper on this than I am on many subjects, much more greater overall economic growth in the long run, because when you provide more widely distributed wealth to people who need it, they spend it and they pour it into the economy. And if you're invested in that economy, then that economy grows faster than if you simply fund, frankly, more wealth for people who then urge cities and co-determination nations to destroy bridges to allow their new yacht to go out to sea.
Would like to add to that. Further comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say there's I agree with most everything that Leo just said. And in fact, our book isn't really about going after shareholding. In fact, our conclusion is that shareholding is one of those markers that shows you have a strong interest in the corporation, and it's a marker that's easy to manage when it comes to setting up some kind of voting system. So I think Leo's absolutely right. And our book is mostly not about taking down shareholders, but more about elevating other constituents when they are in a similar position. Employees are oftentimes in that position. I would argue gig workers, whether or not they count formally as employees, are actually a perfect example of a class of workers who have a strong interest in the outcome and are very easy to manage, it's easy to manage their vote because they're very easy to identify given the technological advances that we made and how they're tied together. So we almost give an independent argument for independent contractors like gig workers to have representation on the board. So I'm with you, and to the extent shareholders themselves get thwarted by these intermediaries, I think that's a problem too.
I'm with you also, Chief Justice Strine, and I think one of the additional aspects that we haven't talked about in terms of the shifting of forces is that we're recognizing this hypothetical shareholder is so far from who these individual human beings actually are, and trying to think about that in a more precise way. At the same time, we have a new generation of people who are pushing back against this notion that you would be that sort of hypothetical shareholder. That if you're just maximizing shareholder preferences now, even if it's people who are just investing in the big three, that people now want to help employees, and they want to help the environment. And part of their shareholder value maximization is not just about the dollars, it's about how we feel as human beings. And I think that's another aspect of the pressure that is pushing companies, is not only the fact that there are two classes of human beings involved, as Matt says, but that one of those classes, the shareholder, is changing its preferences, or that at minimum we're starting to understand or examine their preferences a little bit more closely.
So I'd like to,
Frank, could I just say the economic point though? I think even in maximizing sort of you're feeling good, we should also say on the most of these dimensions, there's also an economic nexus, because a lot of the externality busts have hurt people economically, because your portfolio inescapably includes taxes, inescapably includes the other companies. And so I think even feeling good, there's also a lot of connection economically between making money in the right way when you're a long-term investor who's really can't actually take your money out till you're 59 or is saving for your kids' college. So it's also fairly hard-headed if you think about the way people think about portfolio risk to actually consider these factors.
I agree. And one aspect of this, of the externality debate and the thinking about long-term value is not just that corporations have not yet been forced to internalize the costs of externalities. It's another more subtle point I think people haven't focused enough on, which is to the extent a board in thinking about shareholder value is looking at externalities, that they're discounting those long-term externalities at much too high a rate. And the mechanisms to encourage them to discount those long-term externalities at something like a social discount rate are actually really important. Kit Greenfield and I've been thinking about this, and I think that's something that we should talk about when we talk about the economic perspective, is that discounting at a cost of capital rate or some rate that's used internally for these models is absolutely disastrous from an economic perspective.
Professor Dubal, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I wanted to just to pick off of something that that Grant said about how sort of gig workers are sort of the type of worker that they were thinking about in terms of folks who could benefit from this kind of co-determination, and I just want to note that, you know, some of these companies, I mean, Dara Khosrowshahi in August of 2020 said that he liked this idea of the German model where you have workers on the board, but he talked about this precisely as an alternative to actually increasing wages, actually, you know, providing workers' compensation. It was a concession to the idea that workers that they would finally comply with the law and treat these workers as employees. And I want to note that because, and Grant and Matt have pointed this out in the book, the German model of co-determination is actually a two-tiered system, where there's social co-determination, where the work councils actually elect leaders, and then there's the supervisory co-determination, where those leaders then participate on the board. But that social co-determination emerged not through the beneficence of regulators or state actors or corporations, but through, you know, a robust labor movement that came out of actual worker uprisings. And so I think that sort of discussing this outside the context of the political economy in which we are all living kind of it does a disservice to this moment, because part of what is so exciting about this book is that it is emerging in a moment of heightened interests in labor organizing. You know, some large percentage, unions are still occupy a very, very small part of our economy, but the interest in labor organizing and in direct actions and in extrajudicial direct actions has just, you know, skyrocketed in the last X number of years. And so I want to think about, and I heard this a little bit in Leo's comments, I want to think about this and maybe ask the authors to think about this as part of and related to labor organizing and labor advocacy in a meaningful way.
That's very helpful. Sorry. I was actually going to, just in the interest of time, if you don't mind, I wanted to actually go to the co-determination discussion because it's come up in a number of ways. It's a whole chapter in the book. And, you know, I think we heard different reasons why it works in Germany in particular. But to Professor Duval's point, it comes with it, and I'm paraphrasing here, a lot of history, a lot of support and involvement in unions. And also, I would argue, from my own experience, a cultural support that may not be present here in the United States. So my question is, what would a co-determination model even look like here in the United States? And how would we get there? What sort of incremental approach would there be? And is it even feasible to begin with?
I'll jump at that because I think there's a bridge to where I want to go where Grant and Matt want to go. I just think there has to be an infrastructure built. I want to remind people historically, Professor Duval knows this, the United States pushed co-determination after World War II to defeat fascism from reemerging and built on that. My view, Grant and Matt, a little bit, as you know, is to expand the duties of the workforce of the compensation committee. Eric, stop having them focus just on the C-suite. Make them situate with executive pay within the context of a whole workforce, to go to the point of the gig economy, to include contracted workers. And they have to think about how the contracted workforce is talked about. But when they have these legal responsibilities, allow them to experiment, so long as they are not circumventing unions, to experiment with the European Works Council type of involvement. People forget that even in societies that don't have the top-down co-determination, many of them have the Works Council, which give people real voice about things like family-friendly wages, worker safety. And I think in the American context, I saw my friend Dan Pedrati was on the line, and other labor advocates. I think that we need to get exposed to workers having more voice and power in order to increase unionization. We have this binary thing in the US where you either have a labor union and a lot of worker voice, or no worker voice. And there are reasons for that, because people like Henry Ford sending in people to beat the crap out of the workers and stuff. But I think we need to take a chance in the American labor movement that encouraging more worker voice at non-union companies is actually a bridge to more unionization. And we need to realize that in the European and OECD system, even if you don't have a union, you often are required to have a works council. And so that's a bridge, I think, including, again, having the institutions focus more like Frank and I are thinking on the right things. You know, moving a few dials, I think, Grant, Matt, sort of moves towards your idea. At least that's my kind of practical bridge to that. I also think labor law reform itself, bringing back to life the NLRB in some form of the pro-ex core things, is really important. And a living wage, I think, honestly, having a floor beneath bargaining is really critical to equality. And there's no place in this nation where $15 is too much. And most places in the nation, it's way too little.
Yeah, we agree with that. I think 100%. You know, Grant and I are both longtime labor law professors teaching the course, and I was at the NLRB before joining academia. And you know, part of this, I think, is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, because when you don't have workers participating in corporate governance, then what do the corporations and those who have gotten money from the corporations do with their money? Well, a lot of it goes to pay, you know, PACs and other support groups to get the word out that we don't want, that kind of worker involvement. And it's kind of, cruelly ironic that the workers are generating all this money, and then who directs the political contributions? The folks that are often opposed to them in specific political levels. And I wanted to highlight Vina's point about a concern that, some of this could be framed as, oh, we're empowering workers, but we're not really, right? It's something that I think, Grant and I are very sensitive to. And just referring to that Senator Rubio bill earlier, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, on the one hand, I was happy to see that, a worker member on the board, but it's a non-voting member, and the rest of the bill really tries to undercut unions, which of course is exact opposite of what I think would be necessary to make something like this work. So we are very much of the mind that we need that support structure. We need works councils of some form, or greater involvement with labor unions, and all sorts of, we need those things. But we think that if you kind of wait for the perfect moment, if you wait for the U.S. to become, have all those institutions, we're going to be waiting a long time. And again, right? I mean, this past year, I'd say, has been fairly exciting for labor organizing. But as my history as a labor law professor has been one where the articles generally moan about, this act not being passed, or this change to the law that makes things worse for workers. So we think you have to think about it in a variety of levels, and we're definitely not saying that this is the only way, but we think corporate law has to be part of the conversation in a way that it hasn't been in the past.
Well, and just to give a more specific example of what Matt's talking about, you could argue that you need like supervisory co-determination or works councils in order to, as a platform, in order to get co-determination. But of course, what's standing in the way of that in the United States is forming something like that is an 8A2 violation of the National Labor Relations Act, because it's an electromation committee. Why is it illegal? Well, it's illegal because companies use those kind of committees to give employees false consciousness, to basically fend off real unions. And so you could say the works councils are necessary in order to get a co-determined board. On the other hand, you could also make the opposite argument that you need workers on the board before you get the works councils, because otherwise the works councils are just going to, do what they used to do, and that's why we've made them illegal.
Well, but I mean, these are, but
Grant,
Grant, the last time there were those kind of stooge things in the United States was in the 1930s. I don't think we should confuse European works councils with those. And one practical question I'd ask you and Grant and everybody else who wants to put workers immediately on boards is, where's your source of candidates? And how do you legitimize them? And where do they get information? Because the European system, frankly, even in non-union companies, the union infrastructure provides sources of information and support for people on boards at the other companies. And the works councils provide a natural source of candidates and people with experience and credibility and thing. And that's what I mean about infrastructure. I also think, frankly, pragmatically, it's easier to make progress by building that infrastructure incrementally than trying to get the seismic leap to a vote of Congress for workers on boards. And so I think sometimes you have to build on what you have. I think we've got to be very careful to not confuse works councils in Europe and through the OECD with stooge employee voice. It's got to be something different. And I think that's where having real fiduciary responsibilities on that committee, and also that's where disclosure comes in, Grant, Matt, because remember, I'm the guy guilty a little bit for the median pay thing. If you look at a 2007 article I wrote, and the labor movement slipped that in, if you assume really giving an SEC that would actually give life to that and have quartile disclosure about workers' pay, contracted workers' pay, DEI, and then executive pay, and then you have something like this with the committee being accountable and worker voice, you're starting to give the workforce and society more information. So I don't think anything's perfect, but I think we're at a point where unionization is so low that the labor movement itself needs to take some chances and to give people an experience with voice. Because let's just say what's happened in the last 30 years is certainly not helpful. And even this so-called boomlet, I believe we're at mostly maybe 10.5% we got up to. And then I thought the latest data, maybe Vina, you have it, is that it went down a little bit. And that's just not enough, right?
We have just a few more minutes. I wanted to interject maybe a follow-up question to this particular point. And we've talked about the role or the statements from the Business Roundtable. We've talked about BlackRock. We've heard proposal from various senators from both parties. And we talked about the European system. My question to you, though, is, and I think there's some regulatory solutions out there, but how do you get to even a semblance of what's being proposed here? And does that come from private industry? Does it come from regulators? Does it come from legislators? And then I would add to that, what's the difference in the approach from a federal versus state perspective?
Can I just offer one quick answer to that, which is, I think it's really important in asking and answering any of these questions to have a theory of change of, well, how do you think this happened elsewhere? I think Vina's point about co-determination in Germany emerging from a strong labor movement is really like, it's the key to answering any of these questions, which is, if you look at any institution in which it became more democratic, what was responsible for making that institution more democratic? And I think if you were to take, 1,000 examples at random, in all of them, it's not going to be because people in power suddenly became more compassionate and thought, what I would like to do is enfranchise more people who are currently excluded. It's typically, I think, two things that are relevant for a theory of change. One is a political imagination. So a sense that there are other structures and institutional designs that are possible beyond the ones that we have. And I think that this book fits that bill perfectly. You can imagine other forms of corporations that are not governed by shareholder primacy. But then another really important one is organizing. It's that people who are, especially, whether it's workers or excluded groups, but people who are currently outside the formal power structure, demanding a voice that's included by virtue of what power they currently have. And so, if I were to imagine like the prescriptions of this book coming into fruition, I don't think it's going to be because like every senator turns into Elizabeth Warren or Marco Rubio. I think it's going to be because we reinforce the labor movement to make demands for co-determination. And that, to the extent that this is like an instruction manual for like this, my screen's blurry, but I just held up the book, an instruction manual for what this could look like, just as an assistance to existing organization. I think that's the sort of like incremental vehicle for a much more democratic type of corporation.
Other thoughts? Could someone answer my question, though, about federal versus state solutions?
Well, I mean, we've seen state experimentation in other areas like benefit corporations, and
it's got to be federal.
Yeah,
I mean, because labor arbitrage. Remember, before China was China, it was Japan. Before Japan was Japan, it was South Carolina and Mississippi. And by the way, a lot of co-determination companies, to your point, Professor Bowie, about people like kind of responding to power, a lot of bad news for co-determination in a little bit. It's a geographic concept, which is also something US has to grapple with, Eric. They don't, they really only have domestic German, domestic Scandinavian. It's not an international concept. And a lot of, frankly, German companies located in non-union states in the United States. And so as a practical matter, it really has to come at the federal level. And because we're also talking about a kind of corporate governance that we're thinking really shouldn't vary in terms of its approach to private ordering. We're thinking about a constituency, I think, that needs a level playing field. And so I think some of us and some people, good people on this who are in the audience, are working hard actually to get Congress to act. And that will be hard, but I think it has to be incremental. And I think there's some sense though, that even from the Republicans, who many of whom are elected by workers, and a lot of the Trump voters were workers, is that the economy is not working fairly for all, and we've got to right size this. And it's part of our racial inequality, because Black workers only got labor rights in the really late 1960s. And since the Reagan Revolution has gone backwards, more into wages is going to disproportionately help people who've suffered from inequality historically. But it's also going to help those workers in other communities who are feeling insecure and who are subject to nativist appeals. So it's really can be an important thing for bringing us back together and building on our best traditions rather than tearing us apart.
Eric,
Thank
can
you,
I
Chief Justice Stride. Sure, just a few, that'd be great, Professor Duvall, and then we'll have this be our concluding remarks.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a lot of pressure. I just I want to just comment on one sort of just empirically. There's really good research out by political scientists Paul Freimer and Jake Grumbach about how unionization actually decreases racism, which I think speaks to the empirical reality of what Leo was articulating. And then what I really wanted to say, which is a good place to end on, is that I mostly occupy labor advocacy, policy, and academic environments, and it is so delightful to have read a book that spoke to me so, and the concerns that I have about democracy and inequality using corporate law in such a really, as Nico put it, radical way. I have just been delighted to be in conversation with you all. I have so many new ideas and thoughts and hopes and possibilities, and I'm looking forward to spreading the gospel.
Thank you very much, Professor Duvall. I'm sorry we have to cut it off at this point. Maybe we'll let the powers that be decide if you want to follow up or a reprise, maybe to see how things go in the future. But thank you again for the involvement of our authors. First of all, for writing the book and giving us something to think about and to talk about, and for our panelists and for all of the participants and for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to many of them, but we appreciate your involvement in today's excellent discussion. We encourage you to visit the SMU Rolling Center and Berkeley Executive Ed websites and social media sites to find out more about upcoming events and programming. And we thank all of you for your participation and involvement today and wish you a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.